Go ahead and call the April 16th special meeting of the Ames City Council to order. Good evening, everyone. As you may have guessed, Mayor Hala and Councilmember Garden are out of town, so I will be filling in for the mayor this evening. We do have a couple of items on the agenda before we get to the workshop. There's one item on the consent agenda, a resolution setting April 23rd, 2024 as the date of public hearing to approve the sale of lot 27 in the Baker subdivision. Do you have a motion to approve consent?
So moved. Second.
Moved and seconded. Roll call.
Dutcher.
Aye.
Gartman.
Aye.
Jump.
Aye.
Poirier.
Aye.
Rollins.
Aye.
Leland.
Aye.
Next item on the agenda is the second reading of the ordinance for the citywide designation of the urban revitalization area.
Move approval. Second.
Gartman.
Aye.
Jump.
Aye.
Poirier.
Aye.
Rollins.
Aye.
Leland.
Aye. Aye.
Thank you. And now we will move on to the main event, our workshop on our bike and pedestrian master plan. Damien?
Good evening, Mayor and Council. As Amber said, we are going to go through the bike and pedestrian master plan tonight. As soon as I get the projector turned on. So maybe I might start with the memo that I attached to our two documents tonight. So we're going to be going over the bike and pedestrian master plan and our wayfinding guidance material. So the big thing tonight is we want to make sure we've come to council on a couple occasions, most notably for kind of the kickoff to the plan. Then we came back for some visioning and goals check-in. We also talked about a lot of the public input during those times. We'll touch on some of that again tonight. But what you're looking at tonight is the draft final plan. So it means that the consultant is substantially done with the plan. We want to make sure that we'll go through it tonight, all the elements and how it got developed, make sure council's comfortable with it. But we're not asking council to make any votes tonight. This is really your opportunity to provide feedback to us as staff and to Adam with Tool Design to make sure that the plan is ready for adoption at a future date. A couple of reasons for that. One is that this plan is substantially a development infrastructure plan. And so we'll need to look at what code sections need to refer to the plan so that when we do city projects, obviously we would follow it. And then also as new areas are opened up, new subdivisions or redevelopment, whatever it might be, we want to make sure that the elements of this plan are reflected throughout the community. And then the other item is the wayfinding guidance. That is not something that we're looking for formal adoption, but we will come back with the bike and ped master plan, essentially to accept that the guidance is done and complete, but really it's a document for city staff to implement signage. So it's a technical document for us internally to use, but we wanted to make sure that and Adam will go over the public input that helped develop it. But at the end of the day, it's going to be something that helps us put out signage. So with that, I'll turn it over to Adam.
All right. Thank you.
Real quick, Adam, before you start, for the audience and people listening at home, I just want to be clear that the presentation by staff tonight is for council feedback. And so we won't be taking public comment this evening, but there will be points later on in the process to receive additional public comment.
All right. Well, thank you. Again, my name is Adam Wood. I am with Tool Design. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, and work out of that office, but have the opportunity to work on walk, bike, roll plans and active transportation plans all over the country, and served as the consultant team project manager for this. I also have with me tonight Mitch Holtz with Strand Associates. Mitch and Strand were a subconsultant on this project and supported us in a variety of tasks. Mitch lives here in Ames and it offices out of Ames, and it was great to have them on the project with us. So I have prepared a number of slides, probably way too many slides for us to really go through. And the point of this is to have too much information so that if you have questions and want to dig in more detail on any of these particular pieces, we have more on hand than we may need. I do not want to lecture with this presentation. I just came straight here from the National Planning Conference in Minneapolis. And so I've been in a lot of presentations and I would rather have a conversation with you about this. So if at any point you have anything you want to ask questions about, you want to offer suggestions, comments, what have you, please feel free to interject and we'll be happy to pause. There will be a few times when I flip through slides really quickly, and it's just because I think that's maybe something we don't need to touch on too much. But if you disagree and want to go back, please feel free to stop me, and we'll be happy to do so. So the outline of this presentation, the focus is primarily on the bicycle and pedestrian plan, also known as Walk, Bike, Roll, Ames. I am going to, the way this is structured is in 7 main pieces where we will go through the overview of the plan, talk about how public input shaped the plan and its recommendations. We'll go through the facility toolkit, meaning what are the pieces, what are the puzzle pieces we can use to build the network, to continue to expand the network that exists today. We'll talk about the particular recommendations for the network, so the crossings that were identified, sidewalk gap projects, bikeway and urban or bikeway and trail projects, and then go through and talk about prioritization, the policies or strategies that can support the infrastructure recommendations. And then I want to talk about the public comments that we received on the draft plan before we get into the cost and implementation piece, because I have a feeling the cost discussion and implementation may be something we dwell on for a while. So I want to get through those public comments first. I then have a series of slides on the wayfinding guidelines that are at the end. If at any point you say, hey, let's jump forward to that real quick, we can certainly do that. But I think that this is something that is a little bit more of a technical document in nature. It, as you will see if we get to those slides, has dimensions, has letter heights, all of those sorts of things. And so it's less of a policy type of document, and it's much more about a mechanical aspect, if you will. This is the contents. This is literally a screen grab from the plan document. And I did it in this way just so you could see a couple of things. One is that we have 5 main elements of the plan, and the other is that the plan is less than 100 pages in length. There are, again, 5 sections. The first section is an introduction to the plan. It talks about why we're doing this. It talks about the benefits of walking, biking, and rolling. It discusses the approach that we took, which is informed by the input that you as council have presented or provided to us earlier on in the project, as well as public input received throughout. And it really frames sort of what's the general ethos of the plan. The second section gets into opportunities and needs, and this is both the quantitative and qualitative analysis we performed as the consultant team, but also the summary and analysis of the input we received from the community over the duration of the project. So we took those 2 pieces together and married them together to come up with the key issues and needs that the plan should address. The facility selection and guidelines is sort of the toolkit piece of this. It talks about what are the different types of bike infrastructure, what are the different types of treatments that can be used on a pedestrian crossing to improve it, and so forth. The network plan and priorities is pretty straightforward, as is the implementation strategies and actions in terms of what that looks like and means. So I want to start with a bit of an overview and background and say that this plan, it was very much intended to be and is something that builds upon the existing plans and policies, the overall context of the city of Ames and of the community. We looked at and reviewed a variety of planning projects, planning and policies, some of which have screen or have the covers illustrated on the screen, such as the Lincoln Corridor Plan, the Forward 2045 Transportation Plan, the planning that Iowa State University has been doing from biking and walking and rolling perspectives, and identify key themes, which are elements that all of these plans share in some form or another. And those include the bullet points listed on the slide. I'm not necessarily going to read all of these to you, but essentially it is more multimodal, more sustainable transportation. Walking, biking, transit are really important. We need to do that for a variety of reasons, including providing people more opportunities or more choices in how they move about, and doing so in a way that can be sustainable in the long run. The foundation of the plan is this vision statement and goals, which are shown on the screen. If you recall, we previously met with you and talked through this vision statement and goals, which were developed based early on by public input. We asked this question, walking, biking, and rolling Ames should be, and people were able to provide responses to that. We also talked with the Community Advisory Committee and the Technical Advisory Committee, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. We talked with them about these goals and vision statement, provided them with a survey where they could really provide feedback on specific elements of it, and we made tweaks and adjustments accordingly with that input that was received, and came back and presented that to you and said, here's where this all landed. So the vision statement is what is listed, but it's essentially that Ames is a place where walking, biking, and rolling are good, where they're safe, where they're enjoyable, convenient, and available to everyone. And that's broken down into these 4 goals, which get at really the elements of the vision. So making it safe and comfortable for people. The 2 of those really go hand in hand. If you feel uncomfortable, it's probably because there's some sense that you're not safe in that space. Having a network that's connected makes it easy to use. It makes it easy to get from point A to point B. It makes the overall mode, whether that be walking or biking or rolling in a wheelchair or using a motorized scooter or a skateboard or whatever that implement may be, makes it easy to use. Again, with the long range goals or the long-term goals of health and sustainability, as well as equity and accessibility in terms of who and how people are able to use the network and get from place to place. And when we get into prioritization, I'll hit a little bit more on how we made actionable the equity aspect of this plan. This is an illustration of the overall horizon, or the overall timeline rather, of the planning process. You can see it's been a little less than 2 years since we initially kicked off the project. We went through the early vision and goal setting, evaluated the existing conditions, and in about a year ago, proposed the initial infrastructure plan. So the map of bikeways, trails, crossings, and so forth. We then developed an implementation strategy, which is saying, the prioritization and estimating the costs, identified policy and program recommendations, which were crafted into those strategies and actions that I mentioned earlier. And then that resulted in a draft plan that we are anticipating adoption this spring. I want to talk a bit about public input, and I want to first talk about the phases, and then speak to the level of participation and what that looked like, and then we can get at how did we actually take that input and use that to craft the plan. This may look familiar. We presented this to you early on in the project, but we followed an approach of 3 phases of public input. And the summary of it is kind of phase 1 is what sort of things do you want? Phase 2 is what do you think about these strategies? And then phase 3 is kind of, did we get it right? That's the sort of general arc that we follow here. And you can see the specifics of what that looked like for both the bicycle and pedestrian plan element and the wayfinding component. But putting that into some numbers and talking about the activities that we presented for community engagement. I want to first start with the Community Advisory Committee column. This was a group of people from a variety of different sort of life modes, if you will, different ages, different sort of family statuses, people of different genders, of different ethnic and racial identities and so forth, to get a diverse cross-section of the community. And we went through various steps of this project with that advisory committee, presented them with different ideas, got their feedback. We had a pretty big invitation list. We had at one point asked you all for ideas. We got lots of ideas for people to invite. And the turnout was not the full 40 or so people, but we did have a good group of people. And this was pretty much consistently the same 6 to 8 people attended these 3 meetings, and were able to sort of carry the thread from one input session to another. We had a lot of virtual and online engagement. I won't go through all of these bullets, but you can sort of see the numbers of participants that engaged in these different elements. The online poll, the phase 1 was, again, asking people these broad questions about what should we be aiming for, what should biking and walking and rolling be like, what do you want, what do you like, what do you not like. The second phase, that online map, is where we actually put on an online interactive map. Here's what we're recommending. People were able to comment on it, say, yes, I like this, no, I don't like it, you're missing something. They could draw lines, add points, and so forth. And all of that was then taken into the refined network, the refined infrastructure recommendations that are within the plan. The third phase in terms of virtual and online engagement included a meeting with the Ames Bicycle Coalition to present the kind of preliminary draft recommendations. This was prior to having the document written, but it was showing the maps, showing the strategies and actions and so forth. We then, as you know, put the plan online and received comments. This slide, I realized I have not updated. We had 41 comments. In the end, I initially created this slide before we had all the comments in. The in-person engagement, you can see we had a pop-up event at Iowa State University as part of the climate, what was it, Mitch? Was it climate fair or yeah, is that right? Climate Action Fair, and had good participation there, and then had a draft plan open house more recently and had 38 people attend that. If you add all these numbers up, it comes up to way more than 500, but we have a pretty strong assumption that there were people that participated in multiple activities. And so I think a pretty fair estimate, considering that overlap, is that we had at least 500 people that engaged in the project in some form or fashion. I realize there's a lot going on this diagram, but if you can see the little icon, it's 3 people with sparks coming out of their head. I guess those are ideas that are coming out of their heads. Look at where those are located. These are the ways in which the public input shaped key elements of the plan. So I mentioned earlier the early online surveys and so forth, and the ISU pop-up event where we received input that helped to shape the vision and the goals for the plan. That also helped to shape who the design user is. Are we creating a plan for really active and confident adults, or are we creating a plan for people that are maybe a little less comfortable biking around car traffic? Or is it for everybody? You know, what all does that look like? So those were 2 key ways that public input shaped the plan. There was also input that shaped what sort of recommendations from program and policy up there at the top. Again, this turned into the strategies and actions in the plan, as well as that bottom between the map and the what to build. So the what to build piece is those are the infrastructure network recommendations, the bikeways, the trails, the crossings. So there was that input element there. And then also how prioritization is performed, what sort of inputs should go into determining priorities. And all of that leads to which projects should be built first from a needs-based perspective. And I think it's important to kind of pause and think about who we're serving here. And there's a lot of different ways to define this typical user. One of the things that I find really exciting, but simultaneously very challenging about planning for biking as a form of transportation is that there is such a huge variability in terms of who is doing it, how fast they can bike, how steep of a hill they can go up. All of those sorts of factors. There's much more variability there than there is with planning for car traffic or even planning for people walking. So some of this reflects that variety. But when we get at people that are walking and rolling, again, we get into different levels of physical ability. We get into different sort of needs to care for other people. And you can see in some of the imagery here, parents, grandparents with children, people that are either themselves using a wheeled device or pushing a wheeled device with someone else in it. There are all these sort of factors that play into different experiences. And of course, also somebody's age and their gender identity and their experience based on their full identity can also play into how they experience the built environment, how they move about, and sort of what may limit them or discourage them from making certain choices. So it's really important to think about that broad variety. We could probably describe as many different types of users as there are people that live within Ames, but we really boiled it down to 6 kind of examples. And these are described a little bit further in the plan document itself. I don't need to read through all of these, but I'm sure this resonates hopefully with all of you, that there are these differences and these different types of populations that have different needs in terms of biking, walking, and rolling. Part of the premise of this that I and this is what more something that was really brought from us from the professional perspective is looking at what your travel patterns are like within the community and how those have been changing over the last several years. We used an activity-based travel model. It's a company called Replica, where they use a whole bunch of big data sources, traffic counts, traffic volumes from different things. They use location-based services. They used to use cell phone tracking things until Apple and Google said, okay, we're not going to do that anymore because we're getting in trouble for doing that. But anyways, they have a model built on what they call creating synthetic populations, and they do all this wizardry with the data to kind of look at what are the travel patterns like. And the more you drill down, the less accurate necessarily the data gets. But when you look at it on a high level citywide basis, you can get to some really interesting insights that have a pretty high level of validity. The point I'm getting at with this is that the amount of travel that is happening in Ames today predates the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So people are actually moving about the city a lot more now than they were prior. And you can see the number of differences in trips from an average of 250,000 daily trips to about 300,000 now. What's interesting is when you look at the trip length, a really considerable proportion of those are short trips less than a mile in length. And when you kind of break that down into the modes that people are taking, people are choosing to drive more often than to walk or bike for trips that are between a quarter of a mile and 1 mile. And that's a really key opportunity for, if we provide more opportunities for people to safely, comfortably, and enjoyably walk, bike, or roll, we could see some shifts. And when we think about climate goals, carbon neutrality goals, and so forth, this can be a way to help move toward that. In the plan, there's a series of additional geospatial analyses. One set that I wanted to touch on is the safety analysis piece. And I want to start with the top right chart, which is the crashes by year, and point out the fact that while any crashes are too many, in my opinion, the trend is that the crash rate is decreasing, which is great. That is not the trend across the country. The trend across the country is actually pedestrian crashes are increasing significantly. So it's very heartening that they are decreasing here in Ames, but there are still some corridors where there have historically been crashes. That's what the map indicates. Probably no surprises here. Lincoln Way through campus has been studied numerous times, and we know that crashes occur there. But there are some other key corridors, such as Grand Avenue, Duff, both north and south, University Boulevard. These are mostly larger streets. The other thing I want to point out is the bar chart on the bottom right, which looks at the crash severity. When you look at the very bottom bar, it is all crashes besides pedestrian and bicyclist. And you can see that very few, I think actually 0%, resulted in a fatality during the study period. A smaller portion resulted in a serious injury, that's sort of light blue color. Most had a minor injury or what would be called a possible injury, which means probably not an injury, but we can't say for sure that nobody was injured. Compare that with the bicyclists and especially with the pedestrian crashes. And you can just see that pedestrian crashes are far more likely to result in a fatality or a serious injury when they occur. And so when we think about crash mitigation and so forth, it's great to reduce the severity of crashes, but we really have to actually reduce the instance of crashes for pedestrians in order to get to that same, to get to a decrease in the instances of the severe and fatal crashes. And all of these, inputs went together to form the recommendations of the plan. I mentioned earlier the correlations between feelings of comfort and feelings of safety, and I think this gets at that as well. One of the key things we saw that needed to be analyzed was the level of comfort getting across roadways in Ames. And these sort of teal lines indicate both high stress crossings as well as big gaps between low stress crossings within the city. And so these are all places where it is less comfortable to get across the street than it would be in some of the other locations within the city. So those are key gaps to look at. Later in the plan, later in this presentation, we show you where we have crossing project recommendations. Those very much correlate with where these gaps exist now. So there's a gap, there's a problem, let's identify a potential solution. So all of that, along with a lot of details on the public input that I didn't put all into this presentation, came together to identify the main needs for getting more people to use active transportation in Ames. And we've broken this down into walking and rolling, and then biking and micromobility. And I'll pause to say at the moment, I don't have it in this presentation, but in the plan, there is a green box that talks about definitions. And I do want to just pause and say, in this plan, we refer to, when we say rolling, we're referring to people using a wheelchair or an electric mobility device of some sort, similar to use of a wheelchair. If we're talking about electric scooters or kick scooters or skateboards or skating, that's falling more into the micromobility. Things that at least for when an adult uses it, behave a little bit more like a bike than they do like a person walking. So definitions set there. The key needs are intersection and crossing treatments for people walking and rolling. And then the secondary need is filling sidewalk and path gaps. That is an important piece, especially in certain travel or certain trips in particular locations. A gap in a sidewalk can limit somebody's ability to get to a destination that's right at that location. So it is important. But the intersection and crossing treatments as a whole, or the gaps that are present that I showed a minute ago as a whole, have a greater impact on walkability in the city. From a biking and micromobility perspective, improving the side paths, that is the shared use paths alongside streets, is a top need, as is providing fully separated bikeways, traffic calms, bike boulevards, and then again, intersection and crossing treatments, getting across some of those busier streets. We'll get into this a little bit later. You can see the secondary needs are the bike lanes, bike routes. We heard through the public input that people really don't like painted bike lanes. They would rather have fully separated bike lanes or bike boulevards or something along those lines. There is still a role for bike lanes to play, but it is a very small fraction of what is included within this plan. And I'll show you some information on that later. I'm going to pause, take a drink of water, give you all an opportunity to offer any ideas you might have.
I know Councilman Garden has a question. Tim?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Adam, thank you for your work on this. This is fantastic. This is sort of a big picture question. As we think about the values and goals of our system, there are two that at some point seem to overlap and at some point seem to diverge. One is a recreational use of our system, and the second is one that's more functional for commuting. And so, for example, if we were completely focused on using the bike trail system for commuting, we wouldn't expand the bike lanes or the path at Ada Hayden. But by the same token, there are other places where we really need to identify areas where we can improve opportunities for people to commute. Can you speak for a moment? It would be helpful for me to think about, from an outside perspective, how we should weight these goals, because it has implications for then the capital improvement plans that we make.
Yeah, that's a good question. Our philosophy on that is to not create separate networks for recreation and transportation functions. There are certainly good cases and numerous examples of where having recreation-oriented or solely recreational trails and so forth can be very valuable community assets. As far as creating networks, though, the approach that we try to take is to identify corridors and opportunities that can serve both a transportation and a recreational function. And so in the plan, for example, there are several extensions of what I would call a greenway trail or greenway path along Iowa Creek or Skunk River or some of these other green belts that would certainly be they're linear corridors. They can be used to get from one location to another, but they also would probably be a higher choice for recreational use compared to some of the on-street facilities. I think it's also a challenge, though. It's a challenge because there's different objectives that people have with recreation. Some people do want to go and walk in a loop in a completely natural environment, and that's their approach to recreation, or they may want to bike in that loop. Some people want to get out of town as quickly as they can and go ride on Iowa's famous gravel roads for 50 to 100 to 200 miles. Other people want to go for a ride on very low stress streets or low stress paths and stop at a coffee shop or go to a friend's house and then go back around. So they want to be able to get to those destinations as well. And I think also when we talk about trip purpose and the purpose for biking, the National Household Travel Survey, which is out of date at this point, and so this number is probably even lower or higher depending on how you do the math. But as of the last survey, only 1 out of 7 trips people take are to work. There are a lot of trips taken for other types of purposes, such as going to get groceries, going to run errands, picking up, dropping off somebody at school, all sorts of things along those lines. And so it's not just recreation versus commuting. We also need to think about all of those other types of trips that people take. And that's where we try to take the approach of creating a network that connects destinations while also providing those opportunities for access to nature and so forth.
The only thing I might add to that I know we focused on the plan was areas of heavy use. Probably the best example is when you get in and around campus, or like, for example, when you're up around Ada Hayden, where we know there's paths or walking areas that are heavy use. I think that the plan is trying to focus on facilities that might be widened or wider to facilitate the transportation and the recreation. But as far as a network goes, as far as its connectivity goes, as far as setting funding and priorities, it's all part of one network. It's just where do those heavy mixing areas of the recreation versus transportation use, and making sure there's enough width or enough facility to respond to the demand, but not actually planning for 2 separate networks.
That was further in the materials. To your point, I thought it was very interesting. We'll talk about this, but the access to the schools. So we're obviously very concerned about the safety of our children and making sure that they have safe access to their schools. And so that's another sort of component to this. But thank you both for those answers, and look forward to learning more. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. Anybody else before I plug on? Okay.
I don't know if I have so much of a question right now, but I want to put a pin in this for later.
Okay.
As we look at the safety analysis, we've got, especially around Campus Town, some hot areas, and oddly, I would say in Old Town, which is just north of downtown, with 2 corridors running north-south that seem to be somewhat unsafe, along with 5th and 6th Streets. And those areas, I think, come up in other slides and in the plan as places where we're looking at, do we need crossings? Do we need a new bike route? And so as we move on, I'd like to be able to focus on those, because it's difficult for me, not seeing the data, to understand whether these problems here are pedestrian problems or bicycle problems or both. And it seems like there would be different solutions for each of those issues. So that's, and I'm also interested in Mortensen Road down by University Boulevard, because we've got that focused on as an area of priority, and yet I don't know why people need to cross Mortensen Road, because there is nothing right now on the south side of Mortensen for quite a distance, but it's prioritized. So I'm just trying to put all of that together. And as we move forward, I'm going to try and fit that into the other slides.
Okay, that's great.
And I was just going to add one theme that you might see that relates to some of the crossing safety issues you're asking about is that a lot of them correlate to transit routes. So some of the reasons that people might be crossing the street that may not tie to housing or some other thing might be because they are along a transit route, and they might not knowing the specific spot along Mortensen Parkway, but there could be places where there's a stop and they need to go from that stop to wherever they're going, and it correlated with a crossing need.
Yeah, I believe there's 3 bus stops on the south side of Mortensen at that stretch where that is
Sure.
identified. Yeah, and one thing I will just say about the map is when we're showing crash density, there's two things to think about. One is maybe there are unsafe conditions. The other is that what we call exposure, which is that's where there's a lot of people crossing. So we would expect to see more crashes where there are more people crossing the street. Where it gets complicated is at what point does the amount of crashes that are happening get ahead of or get above what should be expected based on the amount of activity that's happening in that location? So that is one thing to think about when you look at that is it could be that there's just a lot of people crossing there and not necessarily that there's anything wrong or bad with the particular location in terms of the infrastructure. But that's a great question.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to plug ahead then, and let's talk about the facility toolkit a little bit. And I wanted to start with this image, and this is included in the plan. We talked earlier about the wide variety of people that will bike, walk, and roll. And I mentioned in particular the sort of differences, the amplified differences when people are biking. And this graphic particularly looks at biking conditions. We have, and this is in the purpose of the plan, the planning approach. We have set the objective of creating a bike network that serves people of all ages and abilities, which means maybe we don't expect a 2-year-old to bike on their own, but children, adults, people with less confidence biking, people maybe that don't have the stamina to bike longer distances and so forth. And the way that we enable that to occur is by putting the appropriate infrastructure for the context, for the conditions in place. In this chart, you'll see on the left-hand side the little silhouettes of people, and hopefully you can sort of tell what those represent. At the bottom, it's somebody who is very strong and fast, is probably wearing exercise clothes, as opposed to people higher up that may be wearing street clothes. They may not be as comfortable biking around traffic. They may not be able to bike as quickly. That's kind of a representation of the sort of comfort expectations. And you also see the 1, 2, 3, 4, which is the traffic stress number. We have a traffic stress analysis in the plan. I don't have a slide for it, but it essentially is a way of saying how comfortable or uncomfortable are these conditions. And we did that both for the bikeway network and really for all streets in the city from the perspective of biking. And we also did it for pedestrian crossings. So when you look at this, essentially the target is blue or green. So blue or better is what we want to achieve. And that's the sort of condition we have to get more people out there biking at least. And the point to make here is that there are a lot of different ways to achieve that based on the context. You could have a street without any specific bike infrastructure, and it can be pretty good for biking if it has low traffic, if it has lower speeds. Similarly, you can have a really busy street, but if you put a separated bike lane or a side path with few driveway crossings on it, that can also be a pretty good situation or pretty good type of facility for someone to use. So there's different ways to get it. And the last thing I'll say about this is that this is not a recipe book. This isn't saying these are the types of things to do. These are just representations of some facilities that might fit in those different sort of combinations of stress level and category. So the toolkit has a list of the facility types that are included in the plan. The screenshot here just shows two of those, which are separated bike lanes and bike boulevards. For each of the facility types, we have a representative photo. We have an estimate of the cost per mile. As you can see, especially in these two, it can vary quite a bit, and that depends on the existing conditions, the existing cross-section, the particular design of the facility, and so forth. There are elements of guidance for the use of these different facilities, where they're most appropriate. We tied it into the Complete Streets Plan and the street or the place types that are in the Complete Streets Plan. So activity center, urban mix, and residential. And then there's guidance on the design of these. Now, this doesn't override guidance that is out there in a variety of sources, including the AASHTO Bike Guide, which is a big engineering manual for designing bicycle facilities, or the NACTO Bike Guide, or there's a variety of other design guides that are out there. This is not a replacement for that. The SUDAS guide is another example, the one local here to Iowa. But this is a kind of a shortcut. It hits on the key points. Also shown on the slide is a representation of facility selection based on traffic speed and traffic volumes. And it's framed in that way because that is the, kind of the biggest determinant of streets in terms of what can achieve a low stress situation for people. And so you can see if you have a 6,000 vehicles per day and the speed limit is 35, that puts you pretty solidly in the side path or separated bike lane realm. If it's 2,000 cars per day and they're going 25 miles per hour, maybe a bike boulevard, maybe bike lanes. It kind of depends a little bit. I would look at, what the cross section is. Are there any sort of turning movements that are happening? Are there, there are various reasons why you might want to lean one way or the other. And this is all designed to achieve that low stress condition, that LTS 1 or 2 that I referenced earlier. Similarly, for crossings, we have a pretty extensive toolkit of the different elements. So curb extensions, median islands, these are very particular items that can be used and combined, and I'll show you some examples of that in a moment, to create safe crossings. And again, there is some guidance on selection that is an output of research that has been performed on crossings at unsignalized locations to identify the countermeasures that can be used to essentially reduce crash risks at those locations. And it's a flexible framework, so it doesn't prescribe that these are the exact types of treatments that have to happen, but it shows which ones are most appropriate to consider. So there's a lot of different options. There's a lot of different colors of the palette you can paint with in creating a crossing. But to make it a little bit easier, we produce these typical combinations and have them for a couple of different types of situations that are very common in Ames. So obviously you have the large intersection of two major streets. This could be Lincoln Way and Grand Avenue. This could be University and Lincoln Way. There's different examples of what that could look like. That's the big intersection. In the top right is a very common example of where you could put a crossing along a 4-lane arterial street. So 13th Street is an example of this potentially. There are parts of Lincoln Way out west that look a little bit like this. North Duff looks like this in some locations. And then finally, crossing of a what I would call a 3-lane street, a street with 1 lane in each direction with a median in the middle. And you can see these have those sort of green dots with the numbers on them, and that is making reference to what those treatment types are. And so you can see the use of high visibility crosswalk markings in the large graphic in the bottom left. If you look at the number 3, that shows an apron, a mountable apron. So that's a way to actually reduce the speed of right turning car traffic. It is called mountable because it still allows a large truck to roll up and over it so that it doesn't, create, they don't get stuck at the intersection. They can still navigate through the intersection. So those different elements are called out in the document. And these are meant to be sort of shortcuts. They're representations of ideal ways to approach those locations. Okay. Once again, anytime you want to interrupt me, please feel free to do so. Okay, let's get into network recommendations. That's a bit of a wonky term. Infrastructure recommendations. Where are we talking about putting the things is the short version of it. I have 3 maps in here, and there are 3 maps in the plan. The first one is on paths and bikeways. And we put those together on a map because these 2 things are very network dependent. The paths comprise a part of compose a part of the overall bikeway network. They need to work together. And so if we left the paths off, you wouldn't be able to see the full extent of the network. There are obviously a lot of lines on this map. There are some fainter lines. They're wider and semi-transparent. Those are the existing features. So you can kind of see what's on the ground today. We are not wiping the slate clean and starting over. We're building upon what you have today. You have a very extensive path network. Now, in some locations, those paths are too narrow or they are aging and may need to be repaired. So we do identify in that sort of lime green color, the thinner lines are the recommended facilities. We identify locations that are where it's important to widen the path. We have new path locations identified. And then a variety of various on-street bikeway elements, such as separated bike lanes and bike boulevards, are identified. And you can see the table on here shows the miles proposed. We have 78 miles, give or take, of recommended new infrastructure. That's new infrastructure and upgrades to existing infrastructure. So that would include those widened paths. And the vast majority of that is made up of new and widened paths. We have only, 3.5 miles of bike lanes, 1.5 miles of separated bike lanes, 5 miles of bike boulevard. It's a relatively small element. And the reason for that is you have already started building out a path network that's very extensive. In some of these instances, there is space for a path along a roadway. Considering the context, it is appropriate to provide a path along the roadway. Grand Avenue is a good example of this, where it's a state highway. There's a ton of traffic on it. Rather than trying to do a bike lane, it makes sense to have a path alongside. In many cases, a side path functions very similar to a separated bike lane. It is mixed between people walking and rolling as well as people biking, but it still provides a place to bike that's fully separated from the parallel car traffic. You'll also notice on here 2 sorts of point icons. There are the orange circles, and those identify intersections where we have recommended enhancements for bicycle use across the intersection. And then there are the sort of pink stars that are city-county connection points. And that's a reflection of the fact that this network ultimately should extend outside of the city of Ames. These are key places to connect with bikeways within Story County, and we coordinated with Story County on identifying these locations, and they are in the process of developing are they calling it a trail plan or an active transportation?
Story County's trail plan.
Yeah.
It wasn't into a level of detail where we could show anything beyond these connection points. But we do know that as we move forward, we can coordinate with Story County to how they can connect to our network, and both different jurisdictions can extend our networks to each other.
Yep.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Does any of this take into account motorized, like scooters or skateboards and motorized bikes?
Mhm.
But and even with those types of vehicles rolling on sidewalks and things, that was found to be still acceptable in the areas in which you've designated. That would be fine to do there.
This kind of goes back to those definitions. So when we talk about electric bikes or electric scooters or things along those lines, when we talk about bicycles, we're talking about all of that as well.
Okay.
There are clearly potential conflicts between anybody that, some electric bikes can do 28 miles per hour.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone's riding 28 miles per hour and they're passing somebody walking with their baby in a stroller, that's not compatible. The approaches, there's a few different ways that you can tackle that. You can build a fully separate system of paths for people biking, separate from people walking. And we do that in places. Austin, Texas is a great example. There's thousands and thousands of people using it. We built separate paths for biking and for walking.
Okay.
That obviously is substantially more expensive. You can also apply speed limits to your paths, which, I think is a reasonable approach of saying, 15 miles per hour. That's about the speed that people could bike. If they're, maybe a little bit faster than average, 12 to 15 miles per hour. That's another approach. The main thing, though, that's most critical is the same thing that's actually critical whether there's a motor or not, which is making sure the paths are wide enough. There are lots of places right now where you have paths, like West Lincoln Way is an example, that are 8 feet wide and they're against the back of a curb. And if you think about it, you're not going to ride right against that curb because you might fall in the street. So it's almost more like it's 6 feet wide at that point. And if there's a bus stop there, or if there's you can see how it just effectively becomes narrower and narrower. That's a very tricky corridor, obviously, because it's very tight. But when you think about the overall width, that's why we're recommending a minimum of 10 feet, plus that having some setback from the curb so that it's a true 10 feet wide. I think lots of arguments could be made for 12 feet, 14 feet. The wider, the better is sort of generally the approach to take.
And is that a better alternative than structures that would separate, or is it cost that's the primary reason that you don't look at having structures to separate traffic from bike lanes and pedestrians?
Are you saying putting barriers between a path that's shared that's shared biking, walking,
Right.
and then a barrier and then traffic?
Traffic.
I think
I would add one thing that it's not going to be in this plan, but one of the future items that we expect staff to work on is looking at kind of those definitionary limits to any kind of electric powered vehicle. I think right now the cutoff is essentially if it can operate under its own power at 20 miles an hour. Anything above that, it could be considered a motorized vehicle, and we don't want motorized vehicles on our trails typically now, unless the only time we see that is if they're a maintenance vehicle. But I'm talking about the public. So we do have future work that we would probably put more definitions into our code that would address, like what Adam was talking about, any kind of e-bike, e-vehicle that can operate above that 20. I mean, there could be other thresholds we look at.
Okay.
There could be areas where the density of use is that maybe 20 is too much, and we want to have that path be signed at a 15 and have a code that helps enforce a 15 mile an hour operating e-vehicle speed. So I just think there's future work that needs to be done in adding definitions to our code that allows us to regulate, enforce, and I would expect that it would be potentially tiered based upon the density. Ada Hayden, again, is another great example. You may not want somebody shooting around on a Saturday 20 miles an hour with a lot of other activity going on. So, yeah.
And I would say the vertical barrier certainly reduces the stress level and increases the true safety as well. If it's a crash-proof barrier, somebody literally can't drive their car through it. The challenge is if you're already very tight and you put that barrier up, you can't bike right alongside that either, because your handlebars might hit it, or it is still effectively narrows the path. So, but I think that's a design level sort of decision to make, but that can be an effective way as well.
Thank you.
Raises an aesthetic thing as well. Like, is it pretty to have the concrete barrier? Can you come up with a prettier design? So those are all considerations, but that's a great question. Yeah.
Thanks.
Just a quick question. So this is showing a path along Lincoln Way. Can you just talk a little bit about the logistics of putting that in, especially
Easy. It's very easy to do.
downtown to ISU or, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a continuous east-west corridor is obviously very important to the overall network. In fact, multiple east-west corridors need to happen. The Iowa Creek is a beautiful corridor and it's an asset in and of itself, but it also creates a barrier. And that's amplified by the Union Pacific Railroad that goes through and kind of further limits the abilities to get east-west. So finding those opportunities is really critical. So Lincoln Way needs to be something, and what it is kind of the perennial question. Everything in Ames seems to converge on Lincoln Way between campus and campus town. So we did not find we didn't have a magic wand we could use here. What we talked through were different potential solutions to making a connection through there that would be usable, that would adhere. What's the word I'm trying to think of? There are constraints that are on the ground. There are buildings that are close to sidewalk. There's student traffic, foot traffic going across a ton. And so we, went around with a few different options, talked through different things, looked at different scenarios. And this also resulted from the public input on the map, and ended up with looking at a path through there rather than an on-street separated bike lane. Again, conversations with SciRide also were part of this discussion. And it seems like the most feasible opportunity through there is to build a path on the north side. It would take coordination with ISU to do so. And it would, at a couple of points in the corridor, require people to cross Lincoln Way. So maybe on the south side for a good extent, and then cross over to the north side. The alternatives to that would require lots of expensive things that may not be things you want to do, such as land acquisitions and travel lane removal that may result in pretty significant operational challenges through there. I think it's going to be a challenge one way or another. It is the most challenging corridor in the city.
Yeah, I think the question is just whether, like, if we're going to adopt a plan, do we include things that may not be possible?
I think that we've really scrutinized that.
Yeah.
I think there's nothing here. I think we talked about that earlier, maybe a month ago, about some of the more aspirational treatments you could do, and some of those just aren't feasible.
Yeah.
And I think what you're seeing here is a very practical, feasible extension. But you're correct. We don't have a project programmed in the CIPs. Therefore, we haven't gone to the extent of the engineering and the design. Right. But just from an aerial look, we do believe that north side trail and where we would cross it would be where we would start. Until that is a complete dead end, I think this is the path forward we're going to try to move. And I do believe that, like Adam was saying, it's really just working with the stakeholders that are affected on that side of the street. And that's a project issue that we'll work through.
So one of the areas that, at this point, I think the only area in town where we have a separated bike lane is on Ash. Am I right?
That's in a street corridor, I believe so, yes.
So I know that at various points that was showing up in our long-range transportation plan as going through as a separated corridor out to Lincoln Way, and it's no longer there. Does that mean that we've now decided we're going to abandon the separated bike lane on part of Ash because we're now favoring shared use paths and bike, what are we calling them? Bike routes through South Campus neighborhood, as opposed to the direct route through from Mortensen to Lincoln Way on Ash?
I think that what the plan is trying to focus, so the Ash corridor specifically, as you know, was a kind of an opportunity related to the sports complex that Iowa State built. And we had support. I think the rarity that you might find on a lot of the segments, the one that Adam was talking about along Lincoln Way, is that was a place where the public was willing to give up parking. That is pretty rare. I think we've tried to stay away from that whenever possible, because we know the negative feedback we get when we try to do a project that is contingent upon taking away parking. That's not where we want to start. And so that separated path, we know, because anywhere north of there is likely to have that issue where we're not going to start with taking away parking in order to facilitate the extension of this. So we know that we have to transition to some other kind of facility. And so you can see in the plan, one of them is having a path over to Beach, and then the other one is to have an on-street, I believe that is Stanton.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So there's multiple ways that you would be able to go through South Campus area. One would be a path, one would be an on-street option. But yeah, they need to transition out of that, the opportunity we had with that bikeway because of the removal of parking. We need to transition out of it because the rest of the neighborhood north of there is unlikely to want to give up further parking to extend that.
So then I assume that's been removed from the Forward 2045.
It will likely not show up when we do the 2050 plan, yes. But it's not been amended or any of that.
And then regarding the other separated bike lanes that I'm seeing that are on campus, to what extent is that something that we have discussed with Iowa State and they are interested in? Or is it just us thinking this would be great?
Those actually came from planning that Iowa State has done.
Great.
And they have reviewed the plan and the map. and
Their staff is on
provided-
our technical committee.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
I know, but I just didn't know. It's never clear to me how much what our plans say is what Iowa State's plans also say.
Certainly.
So
Yeah.
that's great if that dovetails well.
And I will point out on the map, there's that pinkish background in several locations that does indicate Iowa State University's land. And there are notes in the GIS data files about what's on what would be Iowa State's purview versus cities. So there's recognition of that.
I had a question about the parking removal, actually, since you brought it up as something we, wouldn't want to have to start with. I think there's a lot of these where it seems like we would. So any of the bike boulevards, like Northwestern or Clark, I think that probably is there. Those would mean parking reductions, wouldn't they? I mean, a bike
No.
boulevard.
Not necessarily, not usually. With the bike boulevard, what you're trying to do is create a very low speed, low traffic environment. And in one sense, having on-street parking helps to lower, it can calm traffic. It helps to lower the traffic speed. There's a limit to that in terms of how much traffic volume there is. So if you have, and by traffic volume, I mean cars per day. So if you have a car going in each direction every 10 seconds, you're not going to be able to bike down that street because you're going to constantly be pinched. But if you can lower that to a car in each direction every 45 seconds, every 60 seconds, that's a huge difference in the amount of traffic going through there. There's more space for everyone to kind of share the roadway that remains between the parked cars. So the car parking, looking across the continents in terms of bike boulevard implementation, car parking is not typically removed in implementing it. Now, there are some instances where there may be some select removal of a spot here or there if we needed to put in some sort of traffic calming feature, such as some curb extensions to kind of visually narrow the roadway, or a chicane, which actually requires you to sort of take a little bit of a turn going down the street, again, as a way to slow traffic down. Potentially, curb extensions at an intersection to narrow the crossing for people walking, but it also is a way to visually narrow the street and calm traffic. All of those things could result in the removal of a space or two here and there, but none of the bike boulevard lines on here are we anticipating it requiring removal of parking for entire blocks or anything along those lines. And in fact, I can't tell you where any parking removal would happen because that all is an implementation level, design level decision that would need to occur.
I think the main principle with them is that you want to try and bring the vehicle operations, especially the speeds, closer to the bikes so that they have a similar operating speed along that local street.
Hmm.
And so the people that live along that street who are making kind of those shorter trips from where they live out to maybe a collector street or onto the arterial street system, they're operating at those low speeds for those 2 or 3 blocks that they need to get onto a more major street.
Sure. Thank you.
So one other question, this goes back to where I put my pin earlier.
Okay.
In that area of Old Town north of downtown,
Mhm.
where we had 2
You're gonna crash.
north-south corridors, I think those are maybe Burnett and Douglas, that had orange coloring suggesting that there were more interactions, unsafe interactions between
Mhm.
vehicles and bike rollers. Is the theory of doing the bike boulevard up, is that Clark, where we've got the purple?
Yes.
Is the theory with that we want the bikers to use that corridor and therefore we're creating more safety on those other corridors where we've had problems? Or what's the relationship between the unsafe areas and this new boulevard?
So I think the Clark Avenue, so the 2 on the safety map is, one is Kellogg, and then the other one, yes, I think is,
It's 1 block east of Clark.
so the Clark Street one is actually not on, because we have made some improvements to Clark Avenue, as council knows. So that one doesn't show up on the safety map. It's the Kellogg road segment that probably needs something addressed, which is on the facility map is the one just east of Clark.
Mhm.
And so what we need to do there is try to calm traffic and limit any cut-through traffic that might occur. I think that's probably, in my mind, one of the bigger things that a bike boulevard would try to do to reduce those conflicts that are resulting in crashes, is to try to identify there's probably more volume on that street because they're either trying to avoid Grand Avenue, the signals that are there, for example, or they don't want to be on Duff Avenue in the signals that are there, and they're trying to cut through a neighborhood and probably not focused on driving the right speed or accessing the homes that are there. So the improvements that help calm traffic would also, I think, deter the cut-throughs that are resulting in those crashes, is what the treatment would try to do. And like to Adam's point, until we get into the implementation, which would also have a study, some other more detailed traffic study to go with it, and then you'd identify what those countermeasures need to be.
We can certainly come back. I'm going to flip to the next map, which is the crossing enhancement.
Sorry, I wanted to add one thing on the, can you go back to the previous map? So one thing that I wanted to remind council of, and perhaps anybody watching this, is that one of the reasons we're developing this plan from the long-range plan was that the long-range plan is constrained. The money is constrained. This plan is not. So I think one of the concerns that we heard when Adam will talk to this when we get to the public input that we've had on the plan, is that we're concerned about how quickly we can get the plan done. But what you're seeing here is the entire network without any limitations on spending from a time perspective. And so when we looked at, and Adam will talk about it when we get into the funding section, we're following council's current policy of the $1.2 million average investment into this type of facility. So when we start to talk about the time frames and how much of the plan we can get done, I just want to put it in the right context, because this is kind of everything we need to do within our, until we maybe have a large annexation area. So it feels like perhaps we're not getting a lot, air fingers quote, a lot done, but this is everything we need to do to complete the network. So it could be 20, 30 years plus out. Another thing that doesn't preclude is if there's a development, if there's additional funding, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yeah, you're fine.
But if there's it doesn't mean that an opportunity that comes up to do that facility, we have a plan with a route, with an improvement that we know we need to get done, and those things will happen in the regular course of programming work. But it is as much time as it takes to get this done is what is the time frame of this plan. So
Mayor Hala has a question.
Thank you. May I just suggest, I understand what you're saying, Damien, about the, this is a high level view to Amber's question. I just suggest, it says on the slide, proposed bikeways and paths, and future councils might assume, or the public might assume, that this is going to be part of our CIP. And could you have some kind of like a footnote that would just indicate that, this is a conceptualization, but that in actuality, things might be changing? Because again, we might have residents looking at it and saying there's going to be a 10-foot bike path put on Lincoln Way. I get it. I think it's a good concept. I understand the east-west, certainly something that would be desirable. But just for sake of clarity, is there some way that Adam and his team could somehow footnote that, or somehow, and when we're showing something, it might be misconstrued because we don't have the benefit of the conversation that we just went through. That's all. Thank you.
yeah, I think we can put clarification language within the plan that it's not a CIP and it's not binding as far as programming money, or even maybe perhaps the specific design of the facility. But this is really kind of our best cut at trying to put together a complete network.
Mm-hmm.
I would just we could put it in the plan, in the text. I just think it needs to be also somehow noted or referred to on these diagrams, because probably what's going to happen, people will look at these diagrams, these plans, which are really very helpful, but they may not catch what's put into the text, somewhere else. So maybe it's just saying see comments on page XYZ, whatever it is. I just think it's good for my memory at times can be short, and we may have changes in council. They may not be aware of that or read through, all the pages of the text.
Absolutely. I think we understand that we'll need to put clarification statements.
This map shows the location of the crossing enhancements. The orange circles are those bicycle crossing enhancements that were on the previous slide. On this one, we've also added the pedestrian crossing enhancements. And so you'll notice that the reason we had orange donuts is because some of these black dots fit inside the orange donuts. And those are locations where there's a need both from a bicycle perspective, biking, micromobility, as well as from a walking and rolling perspective. This is overlaid on top of the existing and proposed bikeways and paths. The next slide shows these black dots located on the sidewalk network. But anyway, this shows the general locations. And you can see that they are predominantly along major streets, Lincoln Way, Grand, Mortensen, 16th. So you can kind of see where those are located. These came from our analysis of those crossing gaps, and then also public input on where additional crossing needs were located. And so this is a pretty comprehensive inventory of where those needs exist. Implementing all of them would, of course, be a pretty significant undertaking. The table here shows the breakdown, and it's not exactly a third in each category, but it's roughly a third in each category of signalized intersection locations, crossings of major roadways, 4-lane roadways that are not at a signal, and then crossings of 2 or 3 lane roadways. And I'll just flip to the next slide so you can see the relationship. Now, those black dots are much smaller now on this map because we wanted to emphasize the planned sidewalks that are in the black lines. You can also see on this the existing and planned shared use paths in the green and dashed green lines, and then the existing sidewalks are in the orange lines. And just to clarify, the orange lines are actually the street center lines that have existing sidewalks on them. So it's not the actual sidewalk lines, but it's a representation of where those exist. Not many total miles of sidewalk gap. Ames is fortunate to have a pretty extensive sidewalk network, but there are some key gaps that we identified in the analysis and through public input, and those are what are shown here. They are typically or predominantly rather along arterial and collector roadways.
It's interesting to me that there aren't gaps shown in Old Town, and we know that there are gaps in the sidewalks in Old Town, and there are lots of pedestrians in that neighborhood.
There are, it's a little bit challenging to see just due to the scale of the map. There are some gaps in the orange line work. 12th Street, for example, shows some for a couple of blocks, and then 14th and 15th Streets include some gaps. The analysis we performed is not 100% accurate. It's based on data sets that were available to us and with some checking for verification. So I would say it's probably in the 95% accuracy level for a high level analysis. The Public Works has been doing some additional inventory of sidewalk data.
Yeah, so each year or each cycle, as we get new aerial photography and we get new planimetrics, we can update areas of missing sidewalk gaps. But to the best of the data sets that we have, that's what Adam's referring to. We've developed the plan, but I would expect that as segments get built, as our data collection continues year over year or every 2-year cycles, we would be able to catch and capture some of those data inaccuracies. But it's hard to have a 100% comprehensive data set just given the scale of our town.
Yeah.
So let me go back to my other pin down there on Mortensen Road. We saw on the last map, I think, that we're going to widen the path, which I assume is on the north side of Mortensen because that's where the path currently exists. So this one now is showing we're going to put in a new sidewalk on the south side of Mortensen, but there is nothing between Little Blue Stem and University Boulevard at this point.
So the widening of the path is on the north side.
Right.
Yes. And then the sidewalk is on the south side. And that is predominantly due to the bus stops that exist. So if you're heading eastbound on Mortensen, there are, like I said, 3 or 4 bus stop pairs that exist. And so to get from the bus stop to the nearest intersection and cross, in order, if you were in a wheelchair or if you had, mobility limitations, that would be much easier to do if you had a sidewalk available to you.
So if I'm a developer who happens to own the large piece of land where this sidewalk is, and I'm looking at this, am I interpreting this to mean that the city of Ames is going to put in my sidewalk? Or am I still supposed to be doing whatever developers are supposed to do when they finally develop their parcels?
Yes, absolutely. So when we looked at the funding and we looked at, and Adam will get to that, we do incorporate development as still having the responsibilities under the subdivision code, under the missing infrastructure ordinances that we have. That this plan doesn't trump any of that. So they would still need to do it. This is mainly for areas that have no idea that when development would happen, but it's a priority. Or it might be along a frontage where the city would need to do it. But again, my comment earlier that I made about the funding of the plan, this is a guideline for staff to work for and come back together with come back each year with a CIP and make proposals on the most feasible, the most needed projects that we can fill into a CIP and then have council and public and go through our normal process. So really, I think there could be segments like Mortensen. I think especially if you think about just south of Blue Stem, it's very tight, very hilly. There could be some logistic issues that we may want to push that off and focus on some other locations. But we know within the plan that, to Adam's point, that it connects to side stops, that we should try to find, whether it be through development or a combination of development and city-driven projects, to build out over time and make that connection.
I'm thinking of the mayor's comment about how people might interpret the maps. And I don't know, I mean, I read the section on funding, but I don't know whether the map itself makes clear that this does not commit the city of Ames to putting in this segment of street. It's simply indicating that that's a segment that we need at some point, and we would have the regular mechanisms for ensuring that it's constructed.
Well, absolutely. And I think one of the reasons why we're not adopting the plan tonight is that we can work with our planning department to look at the code sections development that refers to development and development requirements. Council knows that there are some discussions about how things are paid for that are being looked at. And so we would make sure that since planning is heading up that effort, we would make sure that this plan is consistent with that work. And we would put whatever language is needed into the final plan that clarifies the roles of either development paying for certain things or the city paying for certain things, and so forth.
Great.
I think the mayor has a clarification question. Maybe. John?
Sorry. On Oakwood Road and Airport Road, it shows planned sidewalks. Is that indicating that there's going to be sidewalks on both sides along there? And the same goes on the east side of University. I just was curious what that was trying to communicate, because on Oakwood, west of University, we have a nice new path that was just put in with a new road project.
Mm-hmm.
On Airport Road on the north side, there's a nice, it needs to be redone, but a pretty wide path. I was just curious, is this just indicating that we're going to have it on both sides of it, or it's just more or less one side of them? Those are pretty good sized thoroughfares, and I'm just trying to envision that. That was all.
Yeah, I think part of the data set that we had given Tool when they worked on the plan obviously didn't capture some of the most recent projects that the city has done, like Oakwood Road, where those decisions have already been made. So we can try to work with Adam to update some of the recent projects to make sure that there isn't confusing line work. But really, that's what you're seeing here, is that the data that they used to develop the plan, like I said, there was 2 years worth of CIP that occurred. So we can certainly go through it with a little bit more fine-tooth comb and make sure that there isn't, like I said, conflicting information.
Yeah, I will just clarify that, at least as far as what the plan maps are trying to convey, is there is a path on one side. There are missing sidewalk segments on the other side, meaning there's no sidewalk on the other side. And so it's because of the classification of the roadway, the fact that it does carry traffic, providing people an opportunity to walk on that side of the roadway without having to cross at an uncomfortable location.
Yep.
Do we want to move on to talk about priorities? Okay. All right, priorities. We have an approach that is documented in the plan that uses variables that are associated with the goals of the plan. So you can see in this table, the associated plan goals are listed there in the second column. So safe and comfortable, healthy and sustainable, et cetera. We identified variables that we can connect with data, that we feel like those variables are good representations of the goals, or are good, they tie in with the goals. So for example, the crash information, the safety data, is something that we can associate with safe and comfortable. The equity data, the equity variable that we have, is associated with equitable and accessible. And I can talk more about what those variables actually look like. The weighting, well, let me pause. There are 3 different methodologies for prioritizing the 3 different sets of infrastructure. And that's because the 3 sets of infrastructure are different in terms of what they are, who uses them, how they're used. They're also different in terms of why they were identified. What was the analysis inputs that identified where that crossing needed to be, where that sidewalk needed to be. And so the prioritization models are very much tuned to those particular elements. However, by using the same variables and by having similar weighting, they are getting at the same intent, right? So we're prioritizing safety in all of these. We're prioritizing equity in all of these. That's the idea. You'll notice that the weighting is slightly different between the path and bikeway and the crossing and sidewalk. And that is because there is a network completion, a filling of gaps variable that affects the crossing and sidewalk pieces alone. And that's because sidewalk gaps are easy to define. We should, in theory, we should have sidewalks on both sides of every street. So the gap is a gap. The crossing weighting, we had an analysis to identify where those gaps exist. With the bikeway network, it's a little bit less clear what constitutes a gap. And so we didn't really have a data set that was a reasonable variable to put in there. And so instead of leaving that at 0%, we just bumped everything else up to 20%. So that's the reason why there are different weightings, in case you were curious. I will hit on a few of these. I'm willing to. I don't want to force you to get into a math conversation with me, but I'll just hit on a few of these pieces and explain. So this is for the bikeway and path project prioritization. The safety variable is using that historic crash density, which is the map that we showed earlier. And if a project is along a corridor with that historic crash density, it gets points, and that applies to, constitutes 20% of the total priority score. From a use or demand variable, we looked at trip potential. I talked earlier about the amount of trips that are under a mile that people are driving right now. Where are those trips happening? If those are, and we have data to show where those are happening. So those places where a lot of those really short trips are happening, those are opportunities for shifting people to biking or walking. On the equity side, we received data on the location of housing, social services, and groceries. And housing in particular refers to housing assistance and so forth. So they're locations that are affordable housing. And we selected projects that have proximity to one or both of those point data sets. So if a project is near housing and social services, it gets more points than if it's simply just near the housing. So we can kind of get at projects that can connect people to destinations. Level of traffic stress was used for the comfort and lowering of stress. And then for connecting destinations, we looked at the proximity to schools, parks, grocery stores, and then also whether something was on one of the wayfinding priority routes, which we can get to later on in terms of the conversation. So that's the one for path and bikeway. For crossings, you can see very similar in the top few variables. The biggest difference is there at the bottom, those crossing gaps, which I mentioned. So points are awarded if it is along one of those gaps. And we specifically looked at ones that are near bus stops because of the potential for those crossing gaps to really discourage people from taking transit. And then for sidewalks, very similar overall structure, but with the sidewalk gap piece. And again, the bus stop, I realize there's a typo on that one, but the bus stop scoring locations are higher. So that's the general logic, and then this looks at what those results are. And I'll again go back to say that the prioritization approach came out of everything that we heard from the various community input opportunities that were presented. We particularly worked through prioritization methodology with the Community Advisory Committee. This was presented at the open house. We had the weightings and factors identified, and we had these maps. They have been updated slightly, but we had all of this presented at the open house as well. I will say that this is one element of your decision making. if something is listed as a low priority, but you have a roadway project in that location, that's a really good opportunity to go ahead and implement that project while you're there, and you can do it for less money, and potentially you can do it effectively for free if you're already doing things that are requiring you to reconstruct the roadway to begin with. So just because something has a low priority does not mean it's unimportant, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it if you have this sort of opportunity presented. Rather, think of this as those projects where you're going to go out and you're going to do a standalone project, implement something with your dedicated funding. Where should you start? If you say, hey, we're spending $1.2, $1.3 million on active transportation projects, standalone projects this year, start with the ones that are the darker, purple, blue lines. Unsurprisingly, because of the way that the prioritization factors went in, safety, people using it, the equity factors, you'll see the higher priorities are in the central parts of the city where more of these factors exist when you look at those analytical maps. Lincoln Way, Old Town, those corridors come up pretty highly. Again, the yellow lines on the periphery of the city, those show up as lowest priority. And part of that's because there's not development in those locations yet. So things like crashes are not happening at the higher rate. Short trips are not happening there yet because there are not people there yet to make those short trips. But as the development occurs in those areas, they should be implemented. And I think this pertains to the conversation earlier about who's responsible for implementing. This doesn't necessarily change your method to who implements things when development occurs. So that's what it looks like for paths and bikeways. For crossing priorities, a pretty similar pattern exists because of the way that bus stops filtered into this. You'll see some higher priorities that are a little bit outside and some lower priorities a little bit inside, again, based on how those variables all played out. And then finally, for sidewalk priorities, again, looking at the darker lines representing the areas of the higher priority. So that's just sort of how all that plays out. Again, this is one input that's used, budget availability, feasibility, the ability to leverage other projects. All of those things are also factors to think about when you're building your CIP, when you're making those year-by-year decisions.
I think one thing I would add is obviously also the jurisdiction it's in. So there are some, like we've talked about, that are on Iowa State properties. So we would work with them, coordinate with them. And then there's also, especially some of the trail network that's out in the county currently. Those are really reflective of the comp plan growth areas. So those especially we would most likely see as development and subdivision driven projects. So I just think that working with the jurisdictions, if they're not annexed, that's when we would see those projects occur.
Yeah. And I'll just point out, we could have brought this up earlier, but the comp plan growth areas, the alignments that are shown, we worked with planning to identify sort of at this point where we think those lines should be.
Right.
But if subdivision happens differently and the streets are in a different location, this is not set in stone. You should follow those, it should work with how those development patterns actually end up happening.
It still sets the expectation of a facility in that location.
That's right. Okay. Strategies and actions. This is getting into some of the policy ideas and program recommendations. There are 8 strategies identified in the plan, and each one of those we have action items identified for it as well. And so I have slides on every one of these, but I'm not necessarily going to talk through all those action items, but I'm happy to talk about any of them individually that you want to, or I'm not going anywhere tonight, so we can talk through all of them if you want to, but the 8 strategies are listed here. So the first strategy is about increasing maintenance and repair of sidewalks, bike lanes, and paths. So we heard pretty strongly throughout the process that bike lanes are not always enjoyable to use because they have gravel and debris in them. There are sidewalks that have some heaving or some pavement issues that make them harder to walk along. There are paths, especially asphalt paths, where there are cracks that have formed, there are potholes, things along those lines. Just like with your streets, just like with your roadway surfaces, if you don't maintain it, it falls apart and eventually becomes much more expensive to deal with. And so maintenance is a critical piece of keeping the system functioning effectively. Longer term, there's also, thinking about actual reconstruction and replacement, just like you do with roadways. You can build a sidewalk, and sidewalks can last 75 years or more, but at some point, they're done. They have to be removed and you have to be replaced. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second strategy is about lowering motor vehicle speeds. And I talked earlier about the severity of pedestrian crashes when they happen. There's a diagram or a graphic in the plan that shows the relationship between the motor vehicle speed at the time of a crash and the survivability for a pedestrian. If you were hit by a car traveling at 20 miles per hour, 9 out of 10 times you'll walk away from it. If you're hit by a car going 30 miles per hour, it's 5 out of 10. And if they're going 40, it's a half of 0.5 out of 10. It's a weird way of saying it. So it's not a linear scale. There's an exponential increase in the force that's applied. I did not do well at physics, so if anybody's skeptical of that, forgive me, but you get the point that I'm making is like the speed really does matter. And so to the degree to which we can lower those speeds, it increases safety, and it increases safety for people in cars as well. And we have some actions that are recommended associated with that. The third strategy is about standardizing decisions about street, bikeway, and walkway design. We can speak more to this, but this is getting into working some of the concepts into development standards to result in more consistent application, whether it be a city implemented project, a developer implemented project. The fourth strategy is about improving pedestrian crossings, especially near bus stops. One of the key actions we have is to increase coordination between the city and SIRIDE in terms of bus stop placement and crossing locations. Bus stops are one of the places where crossings are concentrated. You cannot ride the bus without crossing the street at some point, so it's a really critical part of your trip. Some of those bus stops are in locations that don't have sidewalks, they don't have crossing infrastructure. If the city goes and invests in building a crossing and you put in crosswalk markings and build a median island and everything, and then SIRIDE decides a year later to move the crosswalk a block down the street, you then have an infrastructure that's not doing what it needs to be or what it needs to do. So that sort of longer range view of making sure we're putting crossing infrastructure where it should be and getting some more clear expectations there is an important strategy to take. The fifth strategy is about encouraging more people to walk, bike, and roll, and not just walk, bike, roll more, but do that instead of driving on occasion, increasingly so. So there are some different strategy or different actions in there rather about ways to do that, and part of it is increasing the ability to park your bike somewhere when you get there. Just like you wouldn't drive somewhere if you knew there was nowhere you could park your car, you wouldn't bike there also if there wasn't a bike rack, if you weren't sure, if you weren't pretty confident you were going to be able to find a place to lock your bike. And especially with the rise of cargo bikes and electric bikes and more people that are riding bikes that cost thousands of dollars, having good bike racks that are not going to scratch your bike up because they're all rusty, that are in easy to access, visible locations, all of that is really important. So we have some actions about that, some recommendations. The sixth strategy is on developing a safe routes to school plan and a safe routes to school program for elementary, middle, and high schools. Safe routes to school is a whole world in and of itself, but it's essentially finding safe ways for kids to walk and bike to school to encourage them to do that more so they get more physical activity. All the research says that when kids walk or bike to school, their brains function at a higher level during the day, they learn more. There's all sorts of reasons why it's a good thing to do, but it has to be safe. And the Safe Routes to School plans are about identifying those very fine grain infrastructure changes. Oh, we really need to build a new curb ramp here. We really need to change the stop sign from this way to that way. Just these very small scale things that can have a big effect. And then the program aspect is, how do we actually encourage kids to do this? How do we encourage families to water? How do we train and teach kids how to do so safely? The seventh strategy ties in with that earlier one about increasing and improving the amount of bike parking throughout the city. And then the eighth strategy is about updating and accelerating the implementation of the ADA transition plan. And so you can see there's overlap, there's interrelatedness between these strategies, but these things were all selected not to be, here's the laundry list of all the plan and policy things you could do, but they're ones that are really tailored to what the needs are here in Ames in particular, and ones that can sort of build off of each other. So again, if anyone's interested, I would be happy to talk through the details on these actions, but I wanted to point out a few key things. One is we have a recommended maintenance framework that is in the plan that identifies ice and snow management strategies, ongoing maintenance needs, pavement management needs, and so forth, and breaks it down by primary, secondary, and tertiary corridors. And there's a map of those corridors within the plan as well. The thing being, more maintenance on the primary corridors. Those are the key spine networks. Those are the places where people are more likely to be using them, higher volumes of users. More maintenance on the primary corridors, a little less on the secondary, and then the tertiary corridors are one step below that. And you can see on some of these, there are the same recommendations across all three types.
I have a question about this one, and maybe it's for Damien, maybe it's for John.
Okay.
When we look at something like the ongoing maintenance of the various shared use paths and sweeping, are our paths now consistently wide enough to accommodate that kind of sweeping? Or is that something that's going to require the widening of the paths so that we can get the equipment we need down those paths?
Well, I think, maybe an overarching comment related to all of these strategies that Adam just talked about. Something that I hope is self-evident is that there are some of these that we have existing policies and practices on. So especially this slide, we worked with Parks and the Street Department to make sure that it reflects our current practices.
Okay.
And so we felt that everything that's being shown on this slide within our current service levels, whether it be operating budget or CIP for shared use path maintenance, is reflected in here. Now, there could be some areas that we can tweak to make improvements within the budget that we have. But so the short answer is no, I don't believe that there's any facilities that we feel we don't have the right equipment or cannot clear the path in a timely manner related to that map that Adam was talking about. We tried to kind of create essentially a map that's analogous to our red route and blue route that we have for the streets. But it just reflects our current activities. So, but any of these strategies that have a cost or service level impact to them that council doesn't already have an established policy for, this plan isn't setting those policies, because we as staff, as you know, bring to you actual policies with real budget impacts through a different process than what this plan is. This is not setting those things. If anything, it may be making recommendations on work that staff would have to be able to, so for if there's not like a maintenance opportunity, let's say a new type of equipment, and we think that that would help meet this goal, we could, through the process that we go through every year, say, can we buy this? Can we afford to buy this new type of piece of equipment? Look at it in the context of the greater budget, yes or no. And then if it is yes, then it can be added. If no, it needs to be delayed or looked at in the future. So anything that could potentially have a cost impact, this is really saying that you need to maybe look in, like this is an area you might be able to improve in, but you need to, there's more work that needs to be done. So
It's good to know that these are already reflecting what our policies are. So it's easier to, well, for me, to keep in mind as I'm looking at it.
Well, Adam's allowed to use the word free. City staff is not allowed to use the word free. So.
Okay. So this is that diagram that I mentioned earlier, and I'll edit my previous statistics that I threw out there. I was going off memory, but you can still see that there is a pretty significant change in the outcomes of the crashes. One of the particular things in here is looking at a limited or a pilot program to lower speeds on residential streets. In fact, the city I live in, Madison, Wisconsin, just is in the process of doing this. They selected 3 neighborhoods. They got tested support, got neighborhood support to implement 20-mile-per-hour speed limits on the residential streets. They're testing it to see what the effect is in terms of are people adhering to the lower speed limits, and then we'll potentially explore expanding that 20-mile-per-hour limit to all local neighborhood streets. So something important to look at, and it's important to also think or to evaluate what the outcomes are of decisions like that. Are they being effective? I mentioned the co-location of bus stops and crossings. There is, a need to make sure that we have the ability to fund these crossings. We'll get more into this later. The mode shift piece, in addition to the bike parking I talked about, there's kind of 2 pieces to that. One is about bike parking requirements for new development. The other is potentially a program to help private existing business locations and so forth implement bike parking, bike racks, in other words. There are also opportunities to do other things that are a little bit more outside of the box, I guess to say, outside of the traditional purview of a bike plan, and that would include things like strategies to try to get people to drive less, whether that be through an employer transportation demand management program, which rewards employees for biking or walking or taking transit instead of driving, to considering, changing, further reducing the amount of car parking required as part of new development standards. The other out-of-the-box idea in here is considering some sort of program to subsidize the purchase of electric bikes. This is something that nobody was doing 2 years ago, and now there are dozens, if not hundreds, of cities across North America that have implemented programs to subsidize the purchase of electric bikes. There's in fact a website where you can track and see information on all these cities and how they're doing it. Denver, Colorado is one of the more famous ones. But there's a lot of other options, or a lot of other examples rather, and that could be everything from a no questions asked, everybody gets a subsidy, to you have to meet certain income limitations. You have to have a household income under so many thousands of dollars to qualify, and it could be capped at a certain amount of money per year. You could say, let's do $100,000 worth of subsidies per year. I mean, that would for the number of people that could get it, that would be a pretty significant benefit for those individuals. Something to think about and continue to explore. I talked about the safe routes to school and the bike parking piece. And then, the update to the ADA transition plan, continuing to inventory the sidewalk obstructions and maintenance issues, reviewing the process for allowing permitted use of sidewalks, so you can make sure you're maintaining compliant, accessible routes. So in other words, do we have clear sidewalks? Is somebody putting cafe tables and sandwich boards and things out there where there's no longer a clear, accessible path? Things along those lines. Okay.
And I would add that things like the safe routes to school, as council knows, we have safe routes to school plans for all of our elementary. And we usually during the Metropolitan Transportation Plan update is when we update those. So we would expect to focus on them. And so some of these obviously are best practices, but there are things that the city is doing, especially the ADA transition plan. We have that and we keep that up to date.
Okay, so I want to go through the draft plan public comments. The draft plan that you have received was posted on the city's website and was available for a full 3 weeks for public comment. Overall, we received 41 comments and inventoried those in a spreadsheet database and went through and sort of categorized, read the comments, identified the themes that came out of those. And I wanted to sort of reflect those to you. I was very happy to see that we had 16 comments of people saying this is great. And it wasn't just, hey, this is a great plan, but it was also thank you to the city for undertaking this effort, for planning for walking, biking, and rolling, and evaluating needs, and so on and so forth. The second largest theme, though, was about funding. And as we'll get to in the next section, and if you looked at the plan, you saw we get to the end and say that we actually don't have enough funding to implement everything. And people got to that and said, that's too bad. We really should increase the amount of funding so that we can build more of what is in the plan. There were 7 comments that pertain to people essentially saying, please don't build painted bike lanes. They're full of gravel. I don't like them. Let's do separated paths or bike boulevards instead. As I showed earlier, we actually have very few painted bike lanes in general. 3.6 miles is where we currently are. However, that does reflect a change we made. We originally had a portion of Northwestern as painted bike lanes, and we have since changed that to a bike boulevard recommendation. That was one that was a little bit on the cusp. It could have gone either way. We initially had it as painted bike lanes because it was a pretty wide street, and wider streets, people tend to drive faster on wider streets, and a bike boulevard, you need people to drive slow. So doing that as a bike boulevard instead of painted bike lanes means there will need to be additional traffic calming measures put in there to ensure that speeds are slower. There were some specific requests for, I want to see a crosswalk at this location, or I really want a trail that goes from here to there, or things along those lines. And we looked at those, and most of them were things that we had already considered and evaluated, and for various reasons, identified as either being too granular for a citywide plan, or being things that we deemed to not be feasible, or they were redundant with some of the more important elements, or the higher, the things that had gotten more public support in the past. There were some comments that related to how we approached prioritization, and in general, it had to do with people saying certain paths should be a higher priority, specifically some of the Skunk River Trail path segments. People said, hey, this should be a higher priority than it is. And I think it's important to kind of go back to what the focus of the prioritization was, which was what can do the most to increase safety, what will do the most to get more people biking and walking for their daily trips, like all of those sorts of things. And so the river trail segments just did not have the proximity to those data sets that we used for prioritization. Again, it doesn't mean those are unimportant, and it doesn't mean that shouldn't be something that is invested in or that there's grant funding for. It did not come as high up in the prioritization model that we had developed. And again, prioritization being one element of the overall equation to how you decide to spend your money.
Well, and I think that's a good example. As council knows, the Skunk River Trail connecting and finishing that from the north to the south has been a priority for a long time, and will continue to be so. I think the only issues that we have is some right-of-way acquisition that's necessary, but that's probably a great example of, we know that the community wants that trail completed, so you would see that as a high priority in our CIP programming. But again, just acquisition of right-of-way being probably the biggest impediment to some of the river trails.
There were, and this does not surprise me, we had some general anti-bike sentiments that said doing any of this is a waste of money, or something along those lines. Every time I see a bike lane, I never see somebody biking in it. Those sorts of comments, which are quite common, before those were received. There were some additional comment themes, and I want to point out that the 4 on the top, we received written comments from the Ames Bicycle Coalition, who I mentioned we had met with and presented our kind of draft concepts to them. And those have the asterisks next to them, so I wanted to point that out in particular. There were 4 comments that essentially said the plan just needs a bigger toolkit. We need more options. We need more types of crossing treatment features. We need more strategies for implementation. And, you know, that is true. We also wanted to not have a 200-page plan. There are a lot of, the plan should not be seen as a limiting factor. It shouldn't be seen as you can only use the things that are included in these pages. But it is, you know, it was limited in terms of what our overall scale and scope for the project included. There were comments that the plan needs specific measurable targets, and there were some references to a mode split goal. For example, 20% of all trips by the year 2045, and I'm just making numbers up, but 20% of all trips by the year 2045 should be taken by bike or something along those lines. That the plan needs to have those sort of specific targets in order to give you something to measure success against. There was a reference to the plan should more explicitly reference NACTO, which is an acronym for North America. I use the acronym so much I don't remember what it stands for.
It's Association of City
National.
Traffic.
That's right, National Association of City Traffic Officials. Sorry, it's the North America that threw me off.
I don't know what a traffic official is.
But it is an organization or a coalition of large North American cities, predominantly United States cities, that have developed a series of design guidelines. There's a bicycle design guideline, an urban streets design guideline, a transit design guideline, and so forth. They're generally seen as being more progressive than the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, AASHTO, another acronym I use way too much. We don't have explicit reference to NACTO in there. That's not to say that anything in here doesn't meet or exceed the expectations or the thresholds that are established in the NACTO design guidance. It's just not explicitly mentioned. It could certainly be added to a list of design guidelines that should be, considered.
I think especially one of those, NACTO being one of probably like Adam was saying, one of the leaders in maybe the newer style of bike and ped facility treatments, that you see those designs, those treatments, the way you are looking at transportation and multimodal transportation has found its way into the rest of the design guidance nationally.
Yeah.
So I really don't see, like Adam was saying, is that the other standards that we refer to don't either are the same or better in a lot of different ways. They're definitely the state of the practice.
The third point I think probably relates to the specific, fourth point relates to the specific measurable targets, which is just this plan needs to do more. I mean, we need a bigger paradigm shift. We need to do it needs to be more impactful in terms of shifting people from driving to walking, biking, and rolling. I think that, this plan is a result of the process that we followed, which dealt with meeting with you as council and asking for your objectives with how we, went through the public process of getting public input. I think some of the paradigm shift that is maybe alluded to or requested in there is somewhat outside of the purview of just what the active transportation plan, the walk, bike, roll plan can achieve. It really would need a more holistic level of sort of policy support, if you will, from comprehensive plan and transportation plan and climate goals and things along those lines, which I think is something that I would encourage you all as council to think about when you're doing your goal setting in terms of how you want to tackle those issues. You can see what these others are on here. There were a couple of typos. The east-west corridor being important. There were two comments that didn't want it to be along Lincoln Way. But as I mentioned, there are physical barriers that are really standing in the way of identifying those other corridors. And then, the question earlier about removal of on-street parking, there was a comment in there about that as well. And I do believe that one specifically mentioned Northwestern. And so with that change, we also made from bike lanes to bike boulevard. That should reduce that concern because, again, there would not need to be, especially in the wide part of Northwestern, there would not need to be parking removal in order to implement a bike boulevard. Before we get into the real discussion about costs, any questions or reflections on the input themes?
I didn't mean to say I was concerned about the removal of on-street bike parking.
No.
I think people are.
People are.
I'm not. Because I think that ties into that, what are we calling it? Strategy number 5, encouraging the mode shift, making driving less convenient, has to do with how much parking is available in general too. And anyway, that I've said a lot about that up here, so you can keep going.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put words in your mouth, but
No,
I was
you're
I was saying that this
fan of
related to that
moving
point.
on-street bike parking myself.
Yeah.
Or not bike parking, but car parking.
One thing that I would like to see us do in the future is to look at the ways we can make connections east-west that are not Lincoln Way. Because it seems like there may be opportunities as we fill in some of this on 13th Street or down connecting on South 16th after we make those improvements and connect to University and Mortensen, that we'd have those opportunities in the future that do not currently exist as obviously as Lincoln Way does.
Yeah. Okay. Who's ready to talk about money?
As long as we don't have to vote on it.
Is that-
No vote.
All right. So any plan that doesn't talk about the cost or the impact of implementation is missing a big component, in my opinion. But I want to hit on this, and I think it's something that's important to discuss because there is a cost to doing all of this, and we have identified the potential cost per mile. Now, I will say that these numbers would fluctuate. We tried to be a bit conservative. We'd rather overestimate the cost by a bit than underestimate the cost. If you build a quarter mile of something versus 3 miles of that same thing, the cost per mile is going to differ because there's an economy of scale that happens. So keep all of that in mind. But we've identified the potential cost per mile. These were in 2023 dollars. And when you multiply the cost per mile for these different types of things against the miles of them or the locations in the case of crossings, you get to total dollars, and you can see 75 million for the bike and path piece, and that's because we are primarily doing paths instead of things like bike lanes, which are much cheaper for good reason, but that's the reality, is that they cost more money. The 22.5 million for crossings, again, there are assumptions about costs here. You can see the 4-lane roadway crossings and the signalized crossings cost more money. There's more happening there. There's more concrete work. Potential signalization means you have to run electric to those locations. There's or have solar paneled flashing, whatever it may be. There's higher costs at those locations. And then the sidewalk piece is the one where it's a single line item. Before we get into the overall thing, I do want to point out that there are, in addition to your annual funding level, there are other funding sources that you should expect to leverage for implementation here. So when we talk about here's what you could fund with your current investment level, that's not taking into account the fact that you can apply for grants. There are increasing amounts of grant funding available. There is the new ATIP, Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program funding that comes out. That's notice of funding opportunities come out recently. There are opportunities to get other funding sources to implement some of this. safety funding grants, the Safe Streets for All program. I don't know if you've heard of that, but there are infrastructure implementation grants that could be used especially for some of these crossing projects. So there are grant opportunities out there, and I highly would encourage you to pursue those. There's also the potential for new development to pay for some of this through, your current mechanism of how that works. And then there's not enough that we can say about the value of leveraging roadway projects, capital projects to implement some of these elements. As I said earlier, if you're going through and you're completely reconstructing a roadway, that's a great opportunity to implement things like some of these crossing projects, sidewalks, so forth. That said, we don't know how many grant dollars you're going to get. We don't know what all those are. We can't really fully forecast what all that is. So this is just simply looking at the total cost of the various elements that are recommended within the plan by those cost per mile or cost per location. The priority level here, the high, medium, low, and low, and so forth, relates to those 5 color categories that we showed on the prioritization maps earlier. So if you were to focus on the high priority locations and implement everything within each of these 3 categories in that top bucket, it would be $18.8 million in 2023 dollars. And when you take your current 1.2 million annual funding, which you've been bumping that up every 5 years, probably will bump up for 2025, so maybe 1.3 million as a starting point. You divide 18.8 by that amount, and you consider the fact that you're looking at about a 15 to 20 year implementation horizon, and that's to basically do 1/5 of the plan. $102 million is a lot to invest in any infrastructure system. And that's, again, where leveraging these other important funding sources I mentioned earlier are really important.
I think one thing I'd point out is that the 2023 dollars is just that, but as every year goes on, that number inflates by our normal inflation. So try to keep things as apples to apples they are, but when we worked on to Adam's point about how fast could we do the high priority, our funding horizon estimates include both kind of an inflationary amount for the revenue side and the expense side.
And I would say, thinking about, okay, 102 million, how much of this do we need to pay for in our own funding versus how much of this could we do as part of roadway projects or grant funding and so forth? If I just go back to this slide for a second, the shared use paths and the widening of existing shared use paths are probably going to be a little bit harder to do as part of a roadway project because they are, larger pieces of infrastructure. The crossings may be easier, bless you, to do as part of roadway projects. Sidewalks, could possibly go either way. I think, that's maybe half of this at least would still need to find funding for. And so even with really aggressively doing grant funding and or applying for grant funding and leveraging these capital projects, there's probably still going to be a shortfall if you're trying to do everything within 20 years. So it's something to consider. Again, this becomes a big policy issue or question for you all to think about in terms of how aggressive do you want to be, how much investment do you want to do, and how would you, what are the trade-offs to get there?
And so based on, just reiterate, based on our current funding guidelines the council has given us for the CIP, about that $1.2 million per year average, that we would get that, we expect to, in a typical plan horizon of around 20 years to get the high priority. If there's other opportunities, other road projects, other grants, historically, we might be able to get around half of the high and about half of the medium high projects done. So that is a large, especially when you would apply like a 3 to 4% construction annual year-over-year inflation to that becomes a very big number as far as investment into this activity. And as council knows, and we don't need to labor it tonight, but this is just one of the funding priorities that you're presented with every year.
Councilmember Garden has a question.
Yes, this is very helpful. Adam, can you speak to the subject of best practices? And it's been a while since we've looked at this, how Ames compares currently with respect to spending with respect to this type of infrastructure. Are we better? Are we worse? How would you help us to think about that? So there's an aspirational aspect of this, but I'd like to have a sense of where we are now.
For cities our size, maybe.
Well, obviously, one of the things that we didn't do is we didn't compare our funding policies to other similar sized cities. We did look at a lot of what other cities are doing. I think the thing that is difficult is the context. Like for example, if you looked at someplace on an extreme end like New York City, they don't have any opportunity to focus on increasing maybe transit or vehicle or their multimodal plan and priorities are very constrained and therefore focused in a different direction. When you have a community of our size, we can still make improvements in a lot of different modal areas. So I think when I looked at it, I think we're mode share. Do you remember what our mode share was? I think we're somewhere around let's say like a 3% walking and biking mode share. And we're probably spending perhaps around 10% of our transportation dollars CIP wide. Just rough numbers, don't quote me on them. But so essentially we're about 3-to-1 to maybe some years as high as 5-to-1 investment in one mode share to make improvements on it. So I don't know how that compares to other cities without doing the research, but as far as we're concerned, we're funding the walking and biking activity on a 3-to-1 or possibly a 5-to-1 compared to vehicle investment or transit investment.
Yeah, I haven't gotten into a really thorough public financing analysis of this, to be honest, but I have looked quite often at various cities. What is your mode share for biking or walking, and what is the percentage of your transportation budget that goes specifically toward biking and walking? And it's usually spending less of a percentage of their budget than they do for the amount of biking and walking that happens. So I would say by that metric alone, you are ahead. I think it's also reasonable to look at what do you want that percentage to be, and how does that compare with what your spending patterns are. But yeah, it's an interesting question, and
but I do.
I ever go get a PhD,
these benchmarks are and looking at best practices aren't meant to constrain us, but I think are helpful just to serve as a scorecard to see where we are. Certainly, there are other demands that we have from the CIP budget that we have to balance against this, and so understanding how other communities are thinking through this balance, particularly that are peer communities, is very helpful. So thank you for those answers.
So I have one question about our current SS4A grant and how the draft of this figures into that, if it does.
Well, I think the focus of the SS4A grant is to identify a high injury network and have a plan to address the mitigation of it. And so I would say that there may be some duplicate effort from a safety analysis standpoint, but in order to meet the requirements of the SS4A grant, it's just done differently. Mm-hmm. Maybe some of the terminology is different. But what I would say is that since it's both driven on that similar crash data, I mean, it's from the historical crash data, that we would see once the strategies required under the SS4A are ready, that they would overlap the safety criteria that this plan has, even though that's just one of the performance measures. And the SS4A would be the focus of the plan would be the injury network and strategies to reduce those injuries.
And I would say the outputs of that can blend really well with the identified recommendations in this plan as well to help you then apply for the implementation. So you have an SS for a planning grant, which you have to have the safety action plan in order to qualify then for the implementation grant funding, of which there is a lot.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a huge pot of money.
I just had a question then about maintenance, since we had talked about what Parks and Rec already does for existing trails. Do we have an idea, as we are moving through this and getting more miles, what that implication for maintenance is going to be for Parks and Rec, whether that is clearing or maintaining? Do we know what that number is?
Well, do you mean as far as the impact on maintenance costs?
Yes.
With more infrastructure?
Mhm.
This plan does not do that evaluation,
Okay.
but when we met with Parks and Streets, they do that quite often. I'm not sure maybe what they've presented to council, but we always look at comparable cities in Iowa for how much lane, essentially center line of streets, and what is the staffing used and the equipment used to, proportionate to center line as kind of a benchmarking to where we are and what service. But it's really difficult to kind of take one city's funding for maintenance and just throw it into Ames, because there could be advantages or disadvantages that we have. But short answer is long-winded. The short answer is this plan doesn't make recommendations on staffing or equipment, but it would give us a proportion of a trail network and a proportion of a sidewalk system in following our policies on how those are maintained. And then I would expect that as that grows, you're right, there's probably some point where staff would need to make recommendations about increasing staffing or equipment. But kind of the nice thing about equipment, and as that technologies improve, it allows one staff member to do more. So it's hard to say what is the magic number for staffing and equipment. We don't know, but it is something that we're focused on always,
Sure.
year over year.
Thank you.
So the remaining slides that I have are on the wayfinding guidelines, and I'd be happy to flip through those. The last thing I'll say on this, unless anyone else has anything, is that, part of our initial objective when we were brought in to do this was to identify funding needs. What is the scale of what we need to do, what we should do, what would be the best practice as far as a series of infrastructure recommendations. And so that's where this number results from. That's not saying if you don't spend $102 million, you've failed. If you spend $180 million, that you've failed, or anything along those lines. And this also shouldn't be seen as, what you should establish your budget level, your CIP funding level at over any given amount of time. It's essentially kind of quantifying the need. If you can find ways to be efficient in implementation, that's great. If you can find these other mechanisms to leverage, even better. So just a little extra context there. Okay, so wayfinding guidelines is the supplement to the walk, bike, roll plan. This, I'm going to walk through a little bit about sort of what wayfinding is and why, and then show you what the guidelines include. So as this says, when you're figuring out how to get from where you are to where you're going, there's kind of 5 steps, and you probably everybody does this, whether you kind of know it or not, when you're going to a new location. You figure out where you're going, whether that's looking at a map on your phone, Google Maps or whatever, or you call a friend or text them and say, how do I get there? So you figure out some way to get there. You orient yourself, again, whether that's by looking at a map or thinking, do I need to go left or right once I leave my house? There is a series of decision-making that happens along the route. Maybe there's a sign like this that says, turn left to go to the park. But otherwise, street signs are key elements of wayfinding. We know, okay, I just passed Grand Avenue. I need to go 3 more blocks, and then I make my turn. Confirmation is another thing. So if you think about, you turn on the street, you go the next block, maybe you check and make sure, am I on the right street or not? You could see that street sign alongside. And then some sort of destination marker recognition. And it could be a sign, it could be a water tower, it could be the facade of City Hall, it could be sort of anything that tells you, I am where I am. So what's the point of all this? The point is, when we talk about a wayfinding system, we're really looking at those three middle steps. We're not building new monument signs at the destinations, and we're not building an app or anything like that to route people. It's about helping people understand where they are and where they're going. And through this process, talked with our advisory committees about the best practices in wayfinding, which are probably pretty obvious when you see it. It should be simple, should be consistent. You shouldn't have to guess what the wayfinding sign is going to look like the next time I see it. It should not require you to have studied to know how the system works. It should be pretty clear and legible. And it's important that it's inclusive of everyone. So let's not just identify the destinations that only ISU students care about, or on the flip side, let's not identify the destinations that only, non-ISU people care about. Let's make sure we're inclusive of all the different types of users and help them to connect to their destinations. So in going through all this, there's a lot of different, I'm actually going to go back. You can see there's different types of signs here. Some of them look like highway signs, that green sign that says Milwaukee straight ahead and McLaughlin Boulevard to the right, and the others are a little bit more designy. They're unique. They have some branding or some imagery to them. Both are fine. They both function about the same. One of them looks different and may kind of help reflect an image. So with this project, we wanted to create signs that had a little bit more of that branding in it. And so we went through a discovery of what are the things that look like Ames? What's out there today? We want to build something that reflects your different images of yourself as a community. So, there's the sort of innovative side of things. You have your city branding, some of the new development that's, has this very modern look and feel. Your famous crosswalk that has, made national news at least a couple of times, I believe. So, there's that side of you. Iowa State is obviously a big side of Ames in your image. And then there are all these sort of more naturalized elements that are out there as well. So all of those things are part of your identity. So we took all that. We also looked at where people should try to go. And this is one of the key ways that the stakeholder input shaped the wayfinding guidelines. We had our committees draw what we call mental maps. We asked people to take a blank sheet of paper and draw the community and draw where there are destinations, what the routes are, all of that sort of thing. These are just a few examples. We received, I think, 20 or so different mental maps. Some of them were quite funny in terms of how people describe their community, but it's a fascinating way to think about how people have in their head what the community's like. And this helps us to understand where those key corridors are, where those key routes are, where those key destinations are, all of that sort of stuff.
Well, I think important thing too about that exercise is these are people obviously that live here or are very familiar with the town. Because I think one of the goals of the wayfinding was perhaps the transient population that we have. How can we set up the wayfinding to try to capture what a long-term resident would recommend to them if they maybe don't know them yet or something to that effect. So I think that was probably, one of the most useful aspects of this mental map was to kind of see between reverse engineer how people think about getting around in that they would make a recommendation to a new resident.
Yeah. We did have several ISU students participate, and one of my favorite ones, just quick tangent, said ISU, downtown, Walmart, North Grand Mall, and then everything else was just labeled corn. Which I'm not sure how accurate that is from an agricultural perspective, but it was funny to me.
We don't have that much corn.
Yeah, I didn't think so, but it was a funny map. So what do we need? What are the needs for wayfinding? There were several things that popped out. One was the need for some trail names. People expressed a confusion, a lack of understanding about navigating some of the trails They might know that they're roughly in the Ioway Creek corridor, but they're not quite sure which path they're on, where they're going. Wayfinding along those trails is identified as important, as was wayfinding along bicycle routes. And just to clarify, in this case, we mean bikeways on streets, so bike lanes, paths along roadways, not necessarily just what you would consider as a bike route. And then critically, and this really pertains to all of this, is some sort of more informative map or trailhead kiosk or something at particularly confusing locations. And there are a few of those things where you have to loop under the roadway on the trail and you end up going in a 360 and you've kind of lost your orientation to which way you're heading. We went through and developed different sign concepts to reflect those brand identities I showed earlier, got input on those, and ultimately ended up with this combination. And so you can see it's got a little bit of the modern element with some of the shapes of the sign that sort of curve on some of the corners. Yet it also has the more natural feel with the color palette that's used on the signs. And for the trail signage, using a wooden post in a metal sleeve. The on-street signage we have on a standard metal post in order to reduce cost and maintenance needs and so forth. You can kind of see that at the tops of the signs, there are names of paths. The Stuart Smith Path, Stuart Smith Park Path is one that's listed on these signs. There is some branding or color coding opportunity. You can see the red signs are ISU locations, so they're able to kind of tie that in with their branding as well. So these are the different types of signs that are part of the overall toolkit. And these are some examples that were just applied on Google Street View imagery of how these signs could exist. So if you're coming off 4th Street and turning onto the Stuart Smith Path, you can see this confirmation sign on the left saying, yes, you're on the right location. It tells you kind of which way to go to get to where. There's a little map on the bottom. You may be asking, why is this on the left side of the path instead of the right side? And that's because this would be a dual-sided sign. So you can see it coming this direction, but it's also for people coming out of the park. They may need a little bit more direction on their side as well. You can see the sign says 4th Street. It's really important. This is something a lot of cities don't do, is tell you where you are when you come out of a trail onto a street. It's important to tell people what street they're on. And you may be able to see that little bit of beige on the side of the post. If I go to this one, you can see over here on the left image, there's basically a street sign for the path as well. You can then see an example of the bike route sign. This is an opportunity to apply it to an existing post. Again, why is this on the left side of the street? That's because we have a side path here on the left. This, by the way, is a good example of one of those paths that's really kind of too narrow. But this is, just again, an example of what these signs could look like. So in the wayfinding guide, we have dimensions for the signs. We have fonts, heights, all of that sort of stuff. There are details about how these would be designed, color kind of coding for different use.
And that's what I meant earlier about this document being, a lot of it being for staff to be able to use.
And then we did some pilot routes, and this has not been implemented, but in order to kind of show how this works, how to make the decision, how to use these different paths, we have these maps that show the alignments, and you can see those gray boxes refer to some of the inset maps where there is a label for where the sign would be. This would be a simple blaze, meaning just the saying go straight ahead. There are directional signs and so forth. And then this is another example of where these are, there's a code. So PD1, this image shows what the sign PD1 looks like. This is directing you to the waiting pool a half mile ahead. Downtown's 1.4 miles if you go straight. There would be a small map. This is in Brookside Park, showing you kind of where you go to, where you are in relation to the various different elements. So I could leave it on that slide, but that's the quick rundown of what the wayfinding guidelines look like. And those are all the slides that I have. So,
Other questions, council? Comments? Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you to all of the members of the public who participated as well.
And so obviously, I think one of the things we touched on earlier is that we've taken note of some of the feedback council's given us about clarification statements, other things that need to go into the plan to make sure we understand roles and responsibilities of how this plan is used. So those are some items we'll take back and work on. Like I said, I have to meet at this point with our planning department to work on some code recommendations, and then obviously getting any last touch-ups onto the wayfinding guide, because that'll come back, and one will be an adoption, one will be essentially a direction for staff to use the guides. And then, as council knows, the budget for this, there was a certain amount for plan development and a certain amount for sign implementation. So once the guide is accepted as complete, staff would work on essentially a design and a bid package to do the first priority corridor of this plan. So with that, there isn't, like I said, any actions to be taken further than that, but those are our next steps after tonight.
Great. All right. We will move on then. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Council will just move on to disposition of communications. We have two. The first one is from Nick Cheney, a request for waiver of master plan for rezoning.
There is a process for this. It would start by putting on the city council agenda. Then we'd have a recommendation to you. That's how you start the process.
I would move we put this on an agenda.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Motion carries. The second item is a memo from Kelly regarding a text amendment for an exception to far and height along Main Street. Sorry.
So this, we already gave you the memo back, gives you options. If you want to pursue this, then you would probably put it on, I don't think you want to request the text amendment yet. You would put on an agenda to discuss this issue.
The options.
Yeah, if you wanted to pursue it.
Okay.
I would move we put it on an agenda so we can discuss it.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Anything else? All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. We will move on to council comments. Tim, do you have anything?
Yeah, just thanks for all the public input on this. What an amazing process, and what a great privilege for us to have, I think, recognized one of the most important voices in this kind of consulting in the country. So the one just final comment I would have, in many ways, when I reviewed the material, it felt like it was validating the hard work that our staff has done through the years. So my hope is that John and Damon in particular should feel that their hard work is being validated. There's not a wholesale overhaul of what we're doing. It's really just tweaking a lot of the good work they put in. So it made me very proud of the work our city staff has done. I look forward to seeing what additional things we can do to improve it.
Thank you. Mayor Hala, do you have anything?
I believe that there's a Earth Day coming up on the 20th. Is that correct? Maybe Susan can fill us in on KAHOI. And just defer to her if she wants to make any kind of comments regarding that. Otherwise, great presentation, and I agree with Councilman Garten.
Susan's not in council chambers tonight, so.
It does say the 20th, though.
But yes, it's on the 20th. Gloria?
I want to thank staff and our consultants. I think we've got a lot of things to consider in the future. And with regard to Tim's question about comparable spending, I quickly Googled Corvallis, Oregon, which is a comparable college town. They've got about 62,000 residents, and they're also working on a transportation plan. And it appears that they have about 1.29 million in their CIP for the kinds of improvements that we were looking at in this plan. And that's part of about a $14.8 million transportation budget. So I think that's maybe a good point of comparison. Corvallis is often compared to Ames at the ITGA conferences because of shared values and similar sizes and needs. That's all I've got.
Thanks. Rachel?
I would just echo my thanks, but nothing else.
I'll also say thank you. And the Earth Day on the airwaves is 9 to 2 this Saturday.
Thank you. Bronwyn?
Nothing for me, thanks.
All right. If there's anything else, I will take a motion to adjourn.
Move we adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.